When empires expand, especially into completely new territories, you always wonder, how do they actually manage all these different people, these resources? It's a massive undertaking.
It really is a fundamental challenge that echoes through history.
Exactly. And today, we're going to do a deep dive into one specific huge example, the Spanish colonial system in the Americas. We're looking at sources like Spanish colonial labor and caste systems to guide us.
Right. And our goal here really is to unpack how that Spanish imperial growth shaped the social fabric, the economies of these new lands over time. We'll look at things like the encomienda, the shift towards enslaved African labor, and that rigid caste system that developed.
Kind of a shortcut to understanding the foundations.
Precisely. The often brutal foundations of these societies.
Okay, so let's start where the Spanish started. They get to the Americas, and immediately there's this huge need for labor, right? For mining, for plantation agriculture.
A massive need. They saw incredible potential for wealth extraction.
And their first big idea, their initial solution, was this system called the encomienda. Columbus himself kicked it off, and it spread pretty much everywhere the Spanish settled.
That's right. It became the dominant model early on.
So break down the encomienda for us. What did it actually entail?
Well, essentially, prominent Spanish men, the encomenderos, were granted tracts of land. But crucially, it wasn't just the land. It included the Native Americans living on that land. They were basically assigned to the encomendero as a labor force.
Coerced labor, essentially, working the mines, the fields.
Exactly. Coerced labor under the control of the encomendero.
Now, there was a justification for this, wasn't there? Something beyond just needing workers.
Oh, absolutely. The Spanish crown framed it very much in religious terms. The idea was tied to spreading Christianity.
Right, a conversion mission.
Yes. They even had this legal document, the Requerimiento, from Ferdinand and Isabella. It basically said the Pope gave them authority to claim the lands and convert the people.
So the deal was supposed to be accept Christianity, get protection.
That was the official line. Submit, convert, be protected, resist, and, well, you could be subjugated, attacked, even killed.
But the reality wasn't quite so neat, I imagine.
Not at all. It was often incredibly brutal. And here's the thing. Even Native Americans who did convert often found themselves still trapped in forced labor, basically enslaved. It shows the deep contradictions right from the start.
So despite this whole religious and legal cover, the encomienda system itself started running into serious problems pretty quickly. It wasn't really a long-term solution.
No, definitely not sustainable. They hit two massive roadblocks with Native American labor.
Okay, what were they?
First, disease. European diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, they just ripped through indigenous populations who had no immunity. The death tolls were catastrophic.
Just devastating population collapse.
Absolutely devastating. And second, the Native Americans knew the terrain intimately. They knew how to survive, how to disappear.
So escape was a constant issue.
A constant headache for the Spanish. They knew the land far better than the colonizers did, making them very difficult to control and recapture. They weren't, good slaves from the Spanish perspective because of these two factors.
So disease and escape essentially doomed the encomienda as the primary labor source. And this failure, this desperation for a controllable workforce, that's what leads them down this truly tragic path towards importing enslaved Africans on a massive scale.
That's exactly the tragic turn it took. They needed a labor force that was, in their view, more resilient to European diseases and less likely to successfully escape.
And they saw enslaved Africans as fitting that horrific bill.
Yes. It's important to note, though, that forms of slavery and selling people did exist in Africa before Europeans arrived in large numbers.
Right, often prisoners of war or maybe debt bondage.
Exactly. But these systems were generally different. People often had some legal rights. It wasn't always permanent. And crucially, it usually wasn't an inherited status passed down generations.
But the European involvement just completely changed the game, didn't it? How did that happen?
It fundamentally altered and massively escalated everything. Europeans set up these fortified trading posts along the African coasts. You hear names like the Gold Coast, the Bight of Biafra.
Trading posts where they exchanged goods?
Yes, trading European goods for enslaved people. And the most impactful good they offered, guns.
Firearms.
Firearms. This had a devastating effect. Certain African groups gained significant military advantages because they had European guns.
Which fueled more conflict.
Precisely. It dramatically intensified raids between communities specifically to capture people to sell to the Europeans. The demand for slaves fueled by guns created this vicious, escalating cycle of violence and capture.
It's just horrifying to contemplate the scale of it. And the justification.
Yeah.
How did Europeans rationalize enslaving millions of people who, clearly looked human? Our sources mention they developed specific thought systems.
Yes, this is where ideology becomes incredibly powerful and, frankly, perverse. Europeans often described Africans as strange, different customs, languages. But like you said, they looked human.
Which should make enslavement morally impossible.
You'd think so. But instead, they constructed these elaborate justifications, these thought systems, specifically designed to argue for the inferiority of Black people, to make enslavement seem somehow acceptable, even necessary.
And there's one particularly shocking example mentioned in the sources, involving a biblical story.
It's genuinely staggering. In the 15th, 16th centuries, Europeans took the story of Noah, his son Ham, and Ham's son Canaan,
Okay.
and they twisted it. They claimed, completely without basis, that Africans were descended from Canaan, whom Noah had cursed to be a servant of servants.
So they used that to say it was biblical to enslave Africans.
Unbelievably, yes. They concluded it was biblical to enslave them. But, and the source is very clear on this, that's not what the Bible says, but that's what the Europeans told themselves. It was a manufactured justification to give divine cover to horrific exploitation.
Let's shift perspective slightly. All this activity in the Americas, especially the silver mining, it must have had huge economic consequences back in Spain itself.
Oh, profound consequences. By the late 1500s, the sheer amount of silver pouring in from the Americas was transforming the Spanish economy.
Making Spain incredibly wealthy.
Well, yes and no. It's more complicated. It certainly enriched the crown and the nobility, the upper echelons, but
Here's a but.
there's a big but. This massive influx of silver actually caused rampant inflation. Prices for everyday goods skyrocketed.
So it hurt ordinary people.
Exactly. It contributed significantly to the impoverishment of the Spanish peasantry. So this colonial wealth, paradoxically, ended up destabilizing the domestic economy for many, concentrating wealth at the very top while making life harder for those lower down.
Okay, so back in the Americas, you now have these distinct populations, Spanish, Africans, Native Americans, living side by side, albeit in a deeply unequal power dynamic. Spain needed a way to organize this new society, didn't they?
They absolutely did. And this led directly to the creation of a completely new social order, something incredibly rigid, the caste system, or Sistema de Castas.
A caste system. And the reason for creating it wasn't just about social control. There was a practical, almost bureaucratic reason.
Surprisingly, yes. While it was deeply rooted in ideas about race and blood purity, the primary practical driver, according to our sources, was taxation.
Taxation. How so?
Well, back in Spain, the system was clear. The lower you were on the social ladder, the more taxes you paid. The government needed a clear way to figure out who was at the bottom in the complex mix of people in the Americas to apply the same principle.
So they needed a hierarchy to determine tax burdens.
Precisely. They needed an orderly way to impose taxes, and this racial hierarchy provided that structure.
So can you lay out that hierarchy for us? How was it structured based on this idea of ancestry?
Sure. Right at the very top, you had the peninsulares. These were people born in Spain. On the Iberian Peninsula itself, they held the highest positions.
Okay, born in Spain.
Below them were the criollos, or creoles. They were of pure Spanish descent, but born in the Americas. Still high status, but considered slightly below the peninsulares.
Right, a subtle but important distinction for them.
Very important. Then came the people of mixed ancestry. Mestizos were those of mixed Spanish and Native American heritage. Mulattoes were those of mixed Spanish and African heritage.
And their place determined their rights, opportunities, and taxes.
Absolutely. And then at the bottom of this hierarchy, you had Africans, both enslaved and free, and Native Americans. They generally bore the heaviest tax burdens and had the fewest rights.
Wow. A meticulously defined racial hierarchy.
Incredibly meticulous. And the system wasn't just some abstract idea. It profoundly shaped and influenced colonial societies throughout the Western Hemisphere, dictating nearly every aspect of life for centuries. Its legacy is incredibly long-lasting.
So just to pull that together, the Spanish need for labor leads to the encomienda, which fails largely due to disease and escape. That failure then fuels the horrific expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, built on these disturbing, twisted justifications.
Yeah.
And finally, to manage this complex mix of peoples and, crucially, to organize taxation, they impose this rigid racially based caste system.
That's the arc, yeah. From labor demands to racial hierarchy.
Which leaves us with a really powerful question to think about, doesn't it?
I think so. The question for you listening is, how do these historical systems, the labor systems, the racial classifications, the economic structures developed centuries ago, how do they still resonate today? Do they cast a long shadow on the social structures, the economic inequalities we still see across the Americas?
What does tracing that history tell us about the present?
Exactly. What does understanding this legacy mean for us now? Something to definitely mull over.